webinar is ready to start now. Do we have someone? Yeah, we have some attendees, so that's good. We can start. So thank you for joining us tonight or today. Here we're going to talk about adaptation and how to track adaptation through different means. We will see different types of tools and digital solutions using either remote sensing or weather forecast and so on to try to better monitor adaptation. We will have 4 speakers today, and I'm very happy to start with Todd Rosenstock. He's a principal scientist with us at the Alliance of Biodiversity International and the International Center for Tropical Agriculture, where he investigate how smallholder agriculture affect the environment and society and vice versa. His research applies observational and manipulative experiments, data synthesis, and modeling techniques to link the best available science with public policy, investment, and programming. Today, Todd is going to present an ecosystem of tools targeted to support identification, implementation, and tracking of adaptations. So over to you, Todd.
Thanks. Let me share my screen. I think you can see that. Great. And so over the next, let me put the timer, otherwise I'm bound to talk too long for this. So over the next 10 minutes, I took a little bit of a liberty here and thought that I would talk about things a little bit wider than tracking to include planning tools as well. And that's largely because you don't know what to track if you don't have an adaptation plan. And so in our team, we're really working towards sort of a broader ecosystem of tools that are interoperable and work together, but then are also standalone for specific users. And so I'll be talking about introducing a few of those tools today. So our organizing principle for this work is really the adaptation cycle that was introduced by the IPCC, and there's really 4 steps to the adaptation cycle. This adaptation cycle also mirrors the investment cycles, project cycles, and things like this, and this really helps stakeholders iteratively respond to the changing climate challenges. And the 4 steps are really assessing risks, planning strategies, implementing actions, and tracking progress. And I'm going to show you one tool for each one of these different steps. And so you can imagine in 10 minutes, we're going to go around the world and around the cycle quite quickly, but hopefully give you a teaser about what some of these tools can do. And so really, we focus and orient our work around the adaptation cycle because this really helps us connect sort of the latest science and the latest thinking to stakeholders and to applications. So the first tool I'm going to talk about is the Adaptation Atlas. The Adaptation Atlas is a digital atlas of community-driven insights on climate risks and responses. And I say insights because we really look at it through a pretty expansive idea of what an atlas is. It's not all about geographic information. It is really about delivering the types of information users, policymakers, program developers need to develop climate rationales for policies, investments, and others. So unlike many atlases that you may see online, this is a set of apps, and you can sort of see this here in the middle. It's a set of small apps that are intended to match specific user questions and user needs. Each one of those when you click on them, is an interactive narrative. And so we specifically designed it in this way. This reduces user flexibility, but a lot of our user research suggested that people were getting lost. They didn't know what the buttons were to click on when they came to other parts of the maps or what they were seeing. And so this provides them more context and more information about what they're doing within the individual apps. We've also adopted a commercial software for building this, and this software is called Observable, which uses a sort of a JavaScript libraries. And so this lowers the bar for many programmers to enter and be able to use this. And this is important for 2 reasons. One, it reduces our maintenance costs because programmers are on our own team. We don't have to hire specialized software developers to develop it, can maintain the apps and build them. And it also enables and lowers the bar for community participation. So many of these what are here called spotlights, are built with different groups that want to surface their data, whether or not that's about specific adaptation issues. And so this allows them to build the apps directly themselves without other people. And so in the planning phase of the adaptation cycle, what I wanted to highlight today was really a program that we call the Evidence for Resilient Agriculture. And this is a data set and a set of analytical routines that identifies what works where in Africa. The data sets are derived from 2,500 journal articles. It characterizes 300 plus management practices and their combinations, and it looks at 75 different outcomes. There's about 100,000 observations that are derived from scientific literature. All of them are classified into a sort of a bespoke hierarchical taxonomy that allows us sort of flexibility in how we analyze them. They've also all been matched both spatially, because all of the observations are georeferenced, as well as temporally. So we've assigned actual sort of planting windows to crops and so forth. And that allows us to connect them to both historical weather information and other publicly available data, really making a very powerful engine. And then we built around this sort of infrastructure for this to be a living evidence synthesis, for us to be able to continue to update this with the ultimate goal of trying to catalog all the information on management practices and their impacts in Africa and then potentially beyond. There's 6 main use cases for this work, and those range, and that's what you see this in this infographic on the right. And those range from policy formulation to investment design to research prioritization, and it's been used already in many of them. The full public release of the data set will be in just a couple months, and so please look out for that. In terms of implementation, just wanted to show a beta version of an adaptation tracking and implementation tool. And this is really a platform for documenting adaptation implementation. So this is, in some ways, I would like to say, impactful science isn't always rocket science, right? And so we don't have a good sense of where people are doing adaptation projects or where adaptation has been occurring across many places. The best sort of lists of programs perhaps have 200 across all of Africa. Well, in 2 months, in 10 countries, we collected over 600 institutions and 1,000 projects. And we did this with just very simple web searching and snowballing. And in the future, we'll actually use natural language processing so we can expand this map across all of Africa. But this allows us to do is make these little network maps. And so we can identify what institutions have high leverage, who's really working in adaptation on this space, who are they working with? So in these network maps, the institution in blue is the institution that's labeled. All the circles in yellow are the projects they have, and then all of the circles in red are other institutions, or the yellow are the other institutions and the red are the projects they have jointly. And so you can see who works with who in what places, and this gives people a lot of opportunity to avoid intellectual cul-de-sacs and look for high leverage connections. Another thing is that we've connected when projects provided actually the amount of investment and the project budgets. This doesn't disaggregate it to individual partners, but you can get sort of a ground up view of how much money is going into adaptation programs in these locations. And this can be used, and is talked about being used by governments and NGOs and private sectors, really to understand sort of the historical actions and to see where they can prioritize where they're putting money. The private sector has approached us a couple investment companies because they want to actually, I use it to identify bankable projects as well. And then lastly, the sort of tracking part of this, we do quite a lot of work on adaptation tracking. And this tool is really for use with government ministries reporting to the UNFCCC. So this is for the global goal on adaptation. And this is for the livestock sector in particular. And so Lucy Jaguna on our team has created this during her PhD. And it's basically a digital survey and dashboard that provides information of indicators that were co-developed between policymakers, livestock keepers, and researchers. So they're very much responding to the adaptation goals of the communities in different parts of the countries. And this has been implemented in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Tanzania. Okay. And so that's just a little bit of a view on the types of work that we do around in adaptation planning and tracking. And so we're really looking forward to the discussion as part of this session, but also then if anybody's interested to work think about collaborations, we're very much always looking for new ones. So please reach out. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Todd, for your presentation. I'm pretty sure there is a lot of synergies between what you just presented and what I'm going to present now, and what Dualta is also doing. So I think that's really already really interesting, this exchange. So yeah, I didn't introduce myself at the beginning of the webinar. I'm Louis Remonda. I'm a senior scientist at the Alliance of Biodiversity International and CIAT. And I co-lead the data-driven sustainability research team, where basically we use a lot of remote sensing, a lot of AI to try to track the impact of human on different types of ecosystems. And one of the work we're doing is what I'm going to present today is the use of a synthetic counterfactual approach based on remote sensing and AI to track the adaptation status across sub-Saharan Africa. So let me share my screen. No, that's not the. So yeah, I'm going to present quickly how to use remote sensing and AI to try to move toward an adaptation index to monitor adaptation needs and progress through time. So first, to be able to do this, we need some sort of model, or we need to define what we are going to look at and how we're going to look at it. So first, we say, okay, agricultural performance dynamic is basically three things. It's weather conditions, how was the climate, or how was the weather, if there are drought, is there particularly a lot of rains and so on, farmer practices and external factors like pest and disease and so on. And based on that, we can say, okay, and what does remote sensing provide us? It provides us information like the time series that we can see on the bottom, where basically we can follow what is the status of a crop at any time. Basically, using different sources of remote sensing at different resolution, we can really have a good idea of what's the status of the crop. So the idea is basically to try to model the status of the crop based on weather conditions and based on long historical data time series. Try to predict what the vegetation should be given what we've seen in the baseline, and look at positive or negative deviation between what we can really observe with the satellite and what was predicted by the model, in particular during shocks, so in particular during droughts and so on, and see if we have better results than what the model predict, or even worse result than the model predict, and be able more or less to try to see what's the status of those crops in terms of response to shock, and thus how they're going in terms of adaptation to climate change. So yeah, that's basically what I just explained now. We are going to build a model that will take as inputs the weather condition and the satellites, the previous satellite imagery. It will predict what the vegetation should look like at any given pixel, and then we will compare the predicted and the measured in the VI or in the vegetation status to try to look for strong deviation between the model and the prediction. To do so, I will not talk too much into details into this, but basically we use a combination of 2D convolutional neural network and LSTM to have both the spatial and temporal dimension taken into account in the model. And we have a bunch of remote sensing based indices and measurement of weather that goes into the model. And with this, we are able to predict millions and millions of pixels. For millions and millions of pixels, we can predict what should be the status of the vegetation given the weather conditions. And we can do it fairly well with our R squared of 0.72 on the test dataset. And then we can apply this ID at large scale here, for example, for all of Senegal in 2023, and start to see where there are strong deviation, positive and negative deviation between the model and the observed satellite measurement. With here a zoom on the Senegal River Valley that we will see more into detail later today. And we can see in blue areas where it seems there is an improvement in terms of vegetation status and cropland status, and in red areas where there is a negative deviation, so the performance are less good than expected. And if we take just this small bunch of pixels with the low resolution imagery but very large scale application, and we dive more into details to try to understand what happened in this area, we can see that, for example, here it was rice cultivation, and that between 2019 to 2022, a lot of the areas where rice was growing suddenly disappeared. And most of the double rice seasons was replaced by a single season during the dry seasons. So with higher resolution, we can then understand better what's driving the changes that we are observing with the satellites. This still doesn't give us all the information about what's actually happening on the ground and why these areas are not performing, or why rice was stopped to be grown in this area, but at least it gives us a hint that something is happening there. The same here. This is in the Endera border in Ethiopia, where during a particularly severe drought in 2015, we can see here in green areas that were performing this time much better than what the system predicted. You can see here the time series. And when we zoom in again, this was a UNDP GEF investment area. And what we can see is that in this area, there's a lot of irrigation that has been put into place. And this was found using another type of satellite imagery, radar SAR imagery, where we can extract the soil moisture for those dates. And this corresponds to the area that were highlighted in green. So this time we can see that implementation of irrigation in this area made that this particular area performed much better, even if there was a drought that was a very severe drought that was ongoing in the general landscape. And yeah, the conclusion for this talk is first, I think there is a great opportunity to use those multi-resolution imagery to try to track and better understand adaptation at a large scale. Just last year, we released this first data set for the whole sub-Saharan Africa. This is still not a very well validated data set and still under development, but if you want to use this handout to go and try and see how it looks, it's already something you can do. There are some limitations to this type of work. For example, it has only been tested on arid landscape. Of course, it works only for seasonal agriculture. So cocoa systems or coffee systems won't work for this type of approach. Yeah, I think that's all for today for my presentation. And this brings us directly to stop sharing to Dualta presentation. So Dualta is a postdoctoral researcher working on AI and climate adaptation with the TAPAS team in the University of Galway. He has a PhD from Trinity College Dublin in astrophysics. He worked on big data solution in that field before pivoting to work on remote sensing and climate solutions for the TAPAS team. Today, Tuatha will present research carried out by his team on assessing the impact of rice production in the Senegal River Valley, so the same area that I just showed on during my presentation, and try to understand post-intervention using remote sensing and AI method to assess the climate adaptation. So over to you, Dolta, and thank you.
Thanks, Louis. Yeah, so I'll just share my screen first. Get that going. Okay. Yeah, so my presentation will just be a short overview of the research we did into the Senegal River Valley, and Louis gave a kind of a good intro there. There might be some overlap, but yeah, basically what we wanted to achieve here was, and what I'll cover here is the kind of twofold. So the region was subject to a large-scale intervention to try and increase rice production, and to stave off, degradation due to climate change and desertification. So we wanted to see if we could quantify that using only Earth observation methods, and then try and use methods similar to what Louis described to try and define climate adaptation in the region. So just quickly, these are all the collaborators that I work with and have put in a lot of work on this project, so it wouldn't be where it is without those people. So some background. This is just a map of the Senegal River Valley. This is like the border between Senegal and Mauritania. The region in red is where the intervention took place. And so the main aim of this intervention was to improve irrigation infrastructure, and the budget for that intervention was about $170 million. It was part of a much larger intervention that amounted to about $500 million US, and it took place from about 2011 to 2015. And so once that intervention happened, there was a post-analysis audit done. And so one thing that we want to highlight is just that Earth observation can be a way to have a faster response time in terms of like what your intervention is actually achieving, and where the funding needs to be targeted. So the three goals of that intervention were to increase cropped area, to increase the cropping intensity, and then to maintain the irrigation network long term, even past the intervention time frame. So to do this, we implemented a couple of different methods. I won't go into depth here because it's probably too complex, but essentially we used the remote sensing data from satellites, and used the machine learning classifier to classify the rice. So there's a lot of large scale crop classifiers out there, but they don't have the temporal resolution we need to have in season crop masks for Africa especially. And so yeah, what we did was develop our own in-season crop masking, and so this first half of the algorithm does that and gives us probabilities for rice being part of each pixel that we're looking at. And then for the cropping intensity, the intervention wanted to increase double cropping and also add a third crop of not rice but tomato and onion, which wasn't successful. But our method to do that was to turn all the time series from our satellites into images, and then we can use a CNN classifier to define which pixels have different seasonality shapes in them, and describe the phenology a bit better. And then finally, we used radar data from satellites to describe the the water volume in each of the waterways in the region. So that's what this these two plots on the right show, the difference between 2016 and 2022 in one particular waterway. And you can see in 2022 the water level was much lower, and so that was using the radar water index to do that. Some of the results that we found from this study, I'll just show over the next few slides. So firstly, here we can see the rice crop being identified here in red, and then if we do this for each season and each year, we can find the areas that are more consistently cropped, and that's what this plot at the bottom shows. So darker regions have been plotted more often over, or have been cropped more often over the last 10 years than the lighter regions. And then the output for our cropping intensity analysis here on the right, this shows basically this is one particular year, which regions have been double cropped and which regions haven't been double cropped. And this region to the bottom here is in gray. It shows like rain-fed crop growth, which is not what the aim of the intervention was. We wanted to move the rain-fed into dry season cropping through irrigation, so it highlights that there was an issue in that area for that year. And just briefly, something interesting, when you normalize to the end of the intervention, so these plots just show cultivated rice area and then normalized cultivated rice area. And so this blue line, the green line is the intervention region of the Delta, and the blue line is a region that underwent a public-private partnership investment, and it drastically outperformed all the other regions, which is definitely interesting for decision-making and policymakers. So, in terms of the water management, this plot just shows the water index and the precipitation in purple there. And we see from 2015 up to 2023 a general decline in water levels, which is also of concern given that one of the aims of the intervention was to outlast the intervention timeframe. And then, yeah, this plot at the bottom just shows some context that there were droughts ongoing, but that from 2020 onwards, there was no defined drought in the region, but yet we still see declining water levels in all the waterways. And so Louis already described some parts of this model. This is a slightly different model, but similar architecture. But basically, the model is trained on data from 20 years ago to 5 or 10 years ago and learns a background pattern. And in this case, it's applied to the biomass for the vegetation indices. And then if we apply that model to more recent times, we get this blue line, which predicts a synthetic value. And the differences between these values can indicate if a region is underperforming or overperforming. At the minute, we're trying to update this to use more recent algorithms like transformers. And also that these indicators could be adapted to use, it doesn't necessarily have to be biomass. This is probably the most base indicator of crop production, but you could also possibly change it to be soil moisture or salinity. And so this is what it looks like when you apply it to some pixels on the ground. So these three plots just show observed, forecast, and the difference between them for a particular season in the region that underwent a public-private partnership. And you can see that there are hotspots that are doing well, and then there's regions that aren't doing so well. There is one downside to this approach, is just that there is some noisiness from pixel to pixel. A lot of them sit around the mean at 0, and then so there's a slight variation from pixel to pixel, but you can see clusters of pixels that are showing up as hotspots, which is definitely interesting. To get around that, then one thing you could do is aggregate. So say in this case, this is still the Senegal River Valley here. If we pick slightly larger regions of interest and subdivide them, we could aggregate over all the pixels in that region, and then find differences in the biomass adaptation. And so if we did that, this is hypothetical values here, but it shows you could see like different trends and where support is needed. And so this is actual data here. the color bar is not labeled here, but red means that an area is underperforming and blue means it's overperforming. Yeah, and you can see, you know, general trends here from region to region. What's interesting is some of these regions have much older irrigation systems and some of them have newer irrigation systems. But that in the intervention delta, which was this kind of central region, that even within that there seemed to be some variation. And then this analysis can be scaled up or down to different regions of interest. So if you wanted to do, you know, hectare scale versus a whole regional scale, you could do that. When you look at this over all the seasons, then the top plot just shows this adaptation value over the early dry seasons each year for all of the regions. So it's a little bit noisy there, but you can still see a general trend downwards, which actually aligns with the our values we derive for the area, cultivated area of rice. We saw a minimum happen in 2020, so it's interesting that the climate adaptation index also shows a slight minimum there as well. And then this bottom plot just shows the late season, which was the traditionally grown rain-fed rice season. And so just to conclude there, I think that the highlight is just that there are methods here for targeting investment in interventions using Earth observation, and it gives us a faster response time, especially if your intervention is over the course of 5 years or so, or 10 years. This intervention in particular had a very low economic rate of return, and we sort of see that reflected in the Earth observation analysis as well. We can use these methods then to quantify climate adaptation through those figures that I showed. And also our team is looking to partner with people to try and implement this in different regions, especially if you have people on the ground where we can validate our results as well. So I think I'll leave it there, and if anybody wants to add any questions in the chat, that'd be great. And I'll hand it back over to Louis.
Thank you, Walter. Very nice presentation and deep dive into this Senegal River Valley. Yeah, now let's go for the next presentation. It will be done by Tiffany Talsma. Tiffany is a team leader in the data-driven sustainability group in the CGR, where she focuses on science to accelerate corporate, environmental, and societal sustainability. And today, Tiffany is going to present the climate resilience platform for supporting private companies in making better decisions in terms of climate resilience and adaptation with their commodity chain. So over to you, Tiffany.
Thank you. Let me orient myself a little. Great. Thanks everyone for joining today. I just wanted to share an example of a tool that we've been developing together with the private sector. And then I think I'm looking forward to the Q&A. So this work started about 4 years ago, right before COVID. We were approached by an agribusiness that was looking for a solution to identify a local climate change risk, understand how it was going to be affecting their business, but not because they wanted to do a risk diagnostic, more because they wanted to understand how to make the business case for adaptation internally with their regional business leads who are making food products, but are not necessarily thinking about agriculture or climate change as part of what they do. And this is the case for a lot of global agribusinesses around the world. They don't see themselves as an agricultural business. They see themselves as a food and beverages consumer products company. And so that kind of internal education within the company is really needed. So making the internal business case and then also finding partnerships that would help to work on the landscape level outside of just the individual farms that they're buying from. So in the case of this example, the particular challenge that this company had was they were buying one crop, in this case potato, which is grown primarily on rented pieces of land that are rented for 3 to 4 months. And then passed along to the next farmer. So when you're trying to work on adaptation practices in that context, there's very little incentive for the farmer to invest in that small parcel of land that they have rented for a short period of time. With regard to soil health management, one of the best adaptation investments that you can make. And in the case of Senegal, for example, we see the switch from rain-fed to irrigation. That's again another very capital-intensive investment to make that would not be feasible on rented pieces of land. So they were really looking then also for a communication tool that would help to bring these other partners around the table to be able to work across the entire calendar for all of the rotation crops that might be coming in, the rice, the maize, the soybean, as well as to provide some cost share with, I think in this case it was Bank of Bangkok that provided then insurance and other agricultural lending to enable and accelerate the adaptation. So what they found is that there was no off-the-shelf solution that provided them those three pieces of evidence of the risk, business case for action, and then prioritizing where to act and what to invest in. So that's where partnership with research that's really focused on the needs of corporates in their supply chain can create quite a lot of value. So we started with that climate impact study back in 2020 on potato. That was so impactful, they were able to leverage 3 million of investment into those farmers that they were working with. So 8 additional countries within the company wanted the same solution. Soon they rolled it out to their indirect crops, what they call their supplier source crops that they buy through other aggregators. And in October last year, we've made this platform publicly available free of charge at openclimateresilientagriculture.com or .org actually. So this has been a iterative process of really co-developing and inventing each new step along the way. So each year was very different from the last. And we're now at the point of, because this is available to the public, really trying to get users on the platform, give us feedback, what are some additional features or crops or geographies that would need to be included there to catalyze the same kind of public-private partnership that we want to see around the world. So let me jump over to the platform. I will give us a very quick demo. And then would love to follow up with anyone who is interested to use this and even just share feedback going forward afterwards. So at the moment, we have the crops that were really of interest to this company with no grower-specific data or anything that would be considered commercially sensitive included in here. If we go to the example of, let's take corn in South Africa, we can see the baseline climate risk that's facing corn growers in South Africa. They currently grow around 7 million acres of corn, of which there's only a high degree of climate risk that they face currently. Most of the other growing areas, how much is this? Almost 80% of the other growing areas are only subject to a moderate degree of climate risk. And we can see what types of risk factors are coming into play, mostly heat stress and drought risk. These are risks that the growers, the maize and corn growers already know how to deal with. It's baked into the baseline agricultural system that they have been operating within. But this is going to change in future. And we want to understand, is it going to change within the range that they can cope with and continue to manage with their existing technology, or is it going to change outside of that range? And that's where we see 43% of the corn producing areas in South Africa are going to be subject to either high or extremely high yield loss risk levels by 2030. So we're not talking about climate change by 2050, we're talking about climate change within the period that the current procurement and agricultural managers are responsible for. But we don't want to just scare them away from growing corn in South Africa. Rather, there is a resilient scenario in which helping growers adapt to those climate risks can reduce the yield loss. And those practices are provided here. For example, use of cover crops, and especially nitrogen fixing cover crops, leguminous crops, have been shown to provide a high impact of yield loss risk reduction, and they can find additional information wherever there are citations. And this kind of gives them a menu of possible priority actions that they can take, sorted by the risk mitigation potential, to prevent that red hot future from negatively impacting the growers too much. So the idea really being to catalyze that investment. So I will stop sharing that one for now and just come back to what our goals are for the future. And for those of you on the call today, apologies for the switching back and forth. So the goal of this platform is really to help accelerate and reduce the barriers to investing in adaptation, especially public-private partnerships, and especially downstream brands that are far away from agriculture, but bear the responsibility to help growers actually be able to adapt. So we really focus on this heat mapping to help accelerate that process. And right now we've been working here at influencing value chains. So working with sustainability teams, helping them make the business case with the senior business leaders and their procurement teams to guide them in the development of climate resilient sourcing practices and climate resilience projects. But from next year, we really want to take this out to the industry level. How can we drive landscape level collaboration, talking about restoration, watershed level conservation programs, and maybe even working with governments on irrigation schemes in places that don't have existing reservoir infrastructure. So how do we then start building up to those increasingly more ambitious partnership programs by making this platform publicly available and open? So how you can help explore the tool. At this point, most of the crops and countries that are in there have been determined by our users. So as you find it useful and have need for other crops and countries, let us know. Share it with people that you think would be interested. You can try playing with some of the templates that are there for sharing the information on the homepage. Send us feedback. I personally received this along with 5 other people on the team to our inbox, and we take any emails from this website incredibly seriously. We give them attention immediately within 24 hours. So please do send us feedback, very valuable. And of course, reach out to me in case you would like to have any other ideas on how to improve this platform. So thank you very much. That's it from me.
Thank you, Tiffany. So I think we've gone through all our presentation for today. I don't know if someone from the audience have any question, can type the question in the chat, and otherwise, yes, thanks for sharing this. Like I used to look forward to putting it further. A shorter and easier
Thank you, Josh. I'm recording that, and I'm going to take it back to stakeholders that I have been trying to hammer with the same message. Yes, I agree. I even struggle to remember the right URL sometimes. It's embarrassing. Appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you for a good recommendation first. And if we don't have any other questions or comments, let's wait a little bit. I would have a question maybe to all of us, but maybe for Tiffany and Todd, and is how do you think we could, for example, use the bottom-up approach that you presented and merge it or use it to inform the search with remote sensing analysis, like do you think that with the last tool that you showed, for example, that shows where and who adaptation works are going on, we could use then the remote sensing to track what's happening and what's the visible effect of this adaptation work is having, or do you think there's enough details into the geographies and so on to be able to use this kind of information to then inform the remote sensing? Or yeah, what would be your take on this?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. That's what we should be aiming to do, and that should be the merger. I mean, the remote sensing provides a really clear and opportunity to identify one part of the results chain. You know, what the tool that I presented at the end tails does provides you all the other parameters of how adaptation occurred, who was speaking to who, what's the household conditions, and then you would be able to see through the remote sensing whether or not vegetation indices had essentially changed and whether or not there was some sort of resilience under some stress conditions. So I think that's the exact way that I've been thinking about it, and I'm glad that you organized this session so we could finally talk about it.
Exactly. We could have a
yeah, and so that's yeah.
Okay, so yeah, I think I will definitely be in touch with you guys to try to see how we can have better synergies between this type of work and different approaches.
Yeah, I mean, and just to build on that just for a second, if I can, I mean, our overall approach to adaptation tracking and much at least of the political discussion is in programmatic discussions are going towards results chains and impact pathways. And so what that allows you to do is narrow down the actual indicators that you would want to have data on to be able to attribute or at least show contribution of programmatic interventions to these types of outcomes that you can then show with remote sensing. And so fitting the remote sensing into the broader framework of these impact pathways and theories of change then provides you really solid theoretical and conceptual basis to ground this remote sensing in, and those benefits that and the mechanism for why you're seeing what you're seeing from the sky.
Yeah. No, so yeah, I totally agree with you. I think that the right way to use this type of information coming from the remote sensing. So yeah, let's try to build something together. And maybe a question for Tiffany. Do you see anything from either from remote sensing or from what Todd just presented that could be embedded in the type of platform that you're building for the private sector that would like be directly useful for the private sector?
Yeah, definitely. I think the approach that we're taking there is really demand driven. So where they've identified a priority area, for example, in that Thailand case, they did end up using some remote sensing after they had used the climate resilience platform to identify some hotspot areas where they needed to work. They did use some remote sensing to then narrow in on which of the producers in their supply chain they really needed to support the most. Didn't end up using it for monitoring, even though we did propose that, inspired very much by the Senegal use case, actually. So yeah, I think there are a lot of those opportunities, but our approach is, can we get as many crops and countries in there now so we at least are kind of sticky? We have like a Velcro effect where we'll snag private sector partners into investing into adaptation, and then once they're snagged, there's any number of solutions that we can develop for them, but we're not pushing those solutions unless they're actually showing willingness to invest in the first place.
And maybe a question for Dualta. So I've got a round of questions. How ready would you say the type of approach that you just showed is to be implemented either at large scale or for different crop and different places? Like, is it still requiring a lot of training data and a lot of work beforehand and before the implementation can be done, or is it something that start to be like quite streamlined and easy to implement in a new area?
Yeah, I would think that you, I think it works in similar climates, right? And for what we did, that's like arid and semi-arid climates. I think moving to a different crop that produces a similar phenology would be fine, and require not a huge amount of effort. Um, but yeah, I think that like if you change to a crop that's significantly different, then it won't work. I know you mentioned like for coffee and that it wouldn't work.
Mhm.
Um, but I do think it's ready to implement at a larger scale. Um, like if, like I said at the end, we're looking for places to run it again and see if we can get similar results, um, and at the minute it's focusing on biomass, right? So this idea of like the amount of greenness or uh, chlorophyll response that you see from the sky will give you some correlation to the actual crop production. But there are other methodologies that you could implement there rather than just focusing on NDVI, I think. Um, but yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but
Yeah, no, definitely. So there's still work to do, but it's ready to be at least scaled up for much larger areas within the same context or within the same type of ag lands and practices, basically. No, that's great. Well, I think we're close to the other hour already. So if there is no more question in the chat or question between you guys.
I have a question for Tiffany,
You have a question for
or maybe we just use the opportunity to chat. I don't know.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, you mentioned it was one of your first slides. The middle section was about building a business case, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about how you built the business case for investing in adaptation with the platform.
Yeah. We mostly very, very simply, like basically it's what is that yield loss risk? What does that translate to in terms of your total production area, what you can achieve from your total production area in future in terms of the productivity gain, and then the additional hectares basically that you would need to farm or source from to make up the productivity loss. So it's a really basic equation. We don't mess around with, obviously there's a lot of commodity pricing that factors into it, and that's not it. But they see something that's in the range of a couple $1 million worth of risk in just one sourcing season. And it's a very high level. There's a whole Excel model behind it, but at the end, the business leaders are seeing one slide that shows our business's plan, our target, how much of that target is at risk, and what we could actually achieve with adaptation. And that's basically the equation. Very simplistic. I can send it over to you if you'd be interested to see the Excel model later. But it's actually been an exercise in how to dumb it down. And the best example I had from one of the executives that looked at this about, 2 years ago, I think it was 2022. He went, "Oh, I get it. This is climate dumbed down for people that don't think about climate." And that is essentially what the platform does. So that people who would always outsource that decision to someone else can finally understand that this is actually their responsibility. It's not someone else's responsibility.
Briefly, I mean, I was going to ask the question that Louis asked to Todd earlier, but and you sort of focused in your response about tracking, but I do think like I would like to hear what you both think about if Earth observation and these kind of methods for adaptation would be useful for the risk side of things, because one thing that Earth observation data allows us to do is go back in time, right? There's a lot of data. And so like if you have a region where there's no data on the ground that's been recorded, like in Earth observation, we can look you know, back 10, 20 years and see which regions were most at risk during like previous shocks, you know. So I just wondering what you thought about that.
Sorry, was that a question for me? My
Oh, either Todd.
5-year-old walked in without his shirt on, and so it was a little bit of a moment. Sorry, I missed part of the question, but I think it was, if I repeat it, was a question about whether or not Earth observation provides potential to look at and quantify risks based on historical events. Is that more or less?
Yeah, like in year four, you had risk and strategy and implementation and tracking, and you sort of said about tracking. I think it has a place in nearly all of them, to be honest, but specifically risk and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, anything, if you can try to quantify the impacts of historical events due to and tie that to the specific weather conditions that were occurring at that time, then I think you're really onto something. And it's not a space that I'm currently working in, so I don't know what the latest is. I imagine people are working on that, but I think if you could apply your methods and get to an impact factor based in sort of a reduction in productivity from that. I mean, I know people are working on it in pasture, whether or not they're working on it in croplands as well. I'm not familiar with, but I think there is definitely an opportunity there.
Cool, thanks.
I mean, at one point we'll move beyond the envelope where historical data can provide us that kind of information. I mean, you could then do something where you looked at sort of the analogs of historical risks, historical locations and climate and historical locations and where that's going to be in 20 years, and then extrapolate risks in that way. Those kinds of things as well. It'd be cool.
Okay. Anything else you would like to add, either Tiffany, Todd, or Delta? No more question this time. And anyway, we are 1 minute away from the end of this session. So I would like to thank you very much, all of you, for your great presentations. I think there is a lot of possible synergies between the works that we are doing, and we should stay in touch. And for anybody in the chat who has a further question for any of the presentation, I think this webinar was recorded, and you can always contact us by email or other means to ask questions or to have further information. Thank you very much, and have a nice evening in my case, and maybe